So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is now my pleasure to present you the work I have been conducting some years ago on a rich assemblage of late classical and early Hellenistic pottery from the city of Argos in the Peloponnese. In July 2011, Sylvian Facha invited me to visit the excavation he was conducting under the aegis of the French School at Athens on the fortification of the Aspis Hill. He wanted some help to find the datation of some sherds and proposed me to participate to the publication with a very short report on this very scarce material. At the museum, I met on that same day Anna and Gilles Touchet, who took this opportunity to show me some boxes of pottery from the excavation with dozens of complete pots and managed to persuade me to start a study of this material. A book is under the direction of Gilles Touchet and Sylvian Facha that include my work should be published next year. I arrived at Argos in the early morning with the idea of looking at some sherds, and I finally left with hundreds of pots to study and to publish. And I think that all pottery specialists experience at least once in their life this kind of trap. But I am very thankful to Anna, Gilles, and Sylvian for this great opportunity it has been for me to lift up my eyes from the ugly Hellenistic pottery of Eretria that I was studying for my PhD and to get a wider view of pottery production. I've already presented in 2015 some results of this research in the second conference of the International Association for Research on the Pottery of the Hellenistic Period, held at Lyon, and published 2 years ago. In this paper, I propose to compare the pottery assemblages of the early Hellenistic period from two so-called peripheric cities, namely Eretria and Argos, in regard to the two main pottery production and innovation centers at that time, namely Athens and Corinth. In my presentation today, I will therefore focus on two other topics related to the aims of our workshop, namely discuss the imports and compare them to the pottery that could be considered as locally or regionally produced to get a better understanding of the pottery repertoire of Argos in the late 4th century. I would also discuss the context of use of this pottery assemblage and try to understand by whom it was deposited on the Aspis. So let's move without further delay to Argos. To the north, the ancient and modern towns are delimited by two acropolis. The higher one, called Larissa, lies to the west, and the lower one, called Aspis, to the north. The French school at Athens had conducted several excavation campaigns, first by Willem Volgraaf in 1902 and 3, then by Gilles Touchet from 1974 to 2015, with some interruptions, of course, and with the collaboration of Sylvian Facha during the latest years. The history of the occupation of this area consists of several phases. The first is a prehistoric settlement with several houses and a fortification of the Middle Helladic period. Excavation also uncovered some geometric and archaic terracotta figurine and pots that could be associated to a sanctuary with a small temple of the 6th century. According to Sylvian Facha, a first fortification without towers is built on the top of the hill in the 5th century, and then connected to the defensive system of the town by two additional walls by the end of the 5th or early 4th century. Finally, a late classical and early Hellenistic phase consists of the reconstruction of the fortification system with new walls, towers, and a triangular bastion. This last phase is associated with two huge cisterns and long building consisting of several adjoining rooms that are interpreted as military barracks. The pottery I will present today comes from several contexts associated with the last defensive program and the building within the fortifications. Most of the material has been discovered by Gilles Touchet and his team in destruction layer and in 4 pits of the southeastern sector. Some pottery has also been uncovered around the building E in the center of the hill by Volgraaf, and some of the pots that I will present today comes from the other sectors to the north and to the south that were mostly excavated by Volgraaf. Unfortunately, not all the sherds that were discovered were kept in the Museum of Argos. In the beginning of the 20th century, Volgraaf kept just some of the nicest pieces from his excavation, and Gilles Touchet and his team collected in the 70s and later all rim, foot, and handle fragments, as well as old sherds with decoration. But most of the wall fragments were discarded after a simple counting that does not allow to produce a precise quantification. Sylvian Fachard kept all shards from his trenches, but there is so few material that this does not offer interesting statistical data. In my work on this material, I try to include all unique shapes and to represent large series of vessels with many examples in the catalogue to offer the best insight of this assemblage, but we should keep in mind that the ASPIS does not provide us quantitative data. Apart from some dozen shards of the early classical and the late Hellenistic periods, the bulk of the material dates back to the end of the late classical and to the first decades of the Hellenistic period. The significant homogeneity of this assemblage seems to witness a short period of intensive and extended occupation all over the fortified area of the hill. In fact, many bases are so similar that they seem to form sets from the same pottery workshops, as you will see in a few minutes. I will not present today all chronological arguments, but I shall shortly mention that this assemblage can be very well compared to some well-stratified deposits from the Corinthia and the Argos. One of the closest parallel for the material of the ASPIS is the field of a drain at Corinth that Ian McPhee and Elizabeth Pemberton recently published and dated to the second half of the 4th century with a terminus antiquum around 310 BC. Some Corinthian graves and a well from the Wakis settlement near Isthmia give arguments to place this assemblage until the early years of the 3rd century at the latest. Closer to Argos, a deposit from the Asclepion of Epidavros, some graves of Hellenico in Tiriatis and 2 wells in Lerna confirm that this material dates back to the second half of the 4th century. It is, however, difficult, if not impossible, to fix with certainty the lower date for this assemblage. The presence of some vessels with Westlock decoration could indicate a deposition in the first quarter of the 3rd century, but this technique seemed to appear earlier in Corinth than in Athens, and we have no idea when potters started at Argos to garnish their production with incisions. Only argument from Silent could help us, namely the absence of grey ungentaria that are produced since the very late 4th century, and the absence of cantharoid that tend to replace the scyphoi in the last quarter of the 4th century. But these arguments are very weak because the evolution at Athens or Corinth are not necessarily happening at the same time at Argos. I propose therefore to place the bulk of this assemblage between the last third of the last quarter of the 4th century and the early years of the 3rd century at the latest. In this assemblage, only one skyphos belonged to the Corinthian form. It is on the top on the left of the screen. All the 35 other scyphoi belong to the Attic form and are characteristic of its latest production phase. Only 3 of them bear concentric decoration under their feet. A few centimeters below the rim, we can observe an horizontal incision that does not appear on Corinthian and Athenian scyphoi, so that it seemed to be a local or regional characteristic. A single scyphos presents a rich decoration of egg and dot under the rim, vertical ribbing on the body, and wavy lines under the enders. Parallels in Argos, Nemea, Mycenae, Epidavros, Lerna, Astros, and Hellenico suggest a regional production of this kind of scyphos that can be associated to the group of the Plaquetan vasen, even if this example is not decorated with mole-made patterns. I shall mention here that Anna Alexandropoulou recently discussed in a paper the existence of a production of so-called Plaquetan vasen in the northeastern Peloponnese. Some one-handlers were also discovered, as well as a series of small cups with 2 horizontal handles that find good parallels only in Azine and Epidavros in contemporary context, so that this shape seems to be strongly associated with the Argolis since the geometric period. Among the drinking vessel, I will finally mention the presence of some mugs that find again their best parallels in Mycenae, Epidavros, Hellenico, and Argos in context of the second half of the 4th century. They could therefore be considered as late version of the famous so-called Pheidias mugs of the 3rd quarter of the 5th century. 2 molded feet fragments could belong to cantharoi or to cup cantharoi of the beginning of the Hellenistic period. As Susan Watroff demonstrated, large craters become very rare at Athens during the Hellenistic period and could have been replaced by metallic vessel or by smaller vases for mixing less quantities of wine and water than during the previous periods. At Argos, craters remained big vases at the beginning of the Hellenistic period, as attested by many fragments found on the Aspis Hill. Two different types of crater were used there in the 4th century. The first is this single example of a calyx crater with vertical groove on the lower body and human figure that were molded separately and then applied to the very high neck of this vase. The majority of fragments belong to the second type, namely the columned crater with vertical webbing on the body, waistcloth decoration on the neck, incised and stamped decoration. Like the skyphos I have shown before, this vessel belonged to the same regional group of plaquette and basin discussed by Anna Alexandropoulou. The best preserved example that you see on the left of the screen does not come from the Aspis, but from the lower tone of Argos. I included it in my study to better understand the many other small fragments from the Aspis. Fineware craters are not produced in Athens and in Corinth after the 5th century and become very scarce during the 4th century, except in Apulia. However, Sarah James recently published a Corinthian column crater with waistcloth decoration that she places in the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, so that we should keep in mind that further discoveries could change our knowledge about this peculiar shape. Among the vessels for the service of wine and other drinks, some mushroom jugs or decanters found on the Aspis can be compared to Corinthian parallels of the 4th century. Only 8 plates were found in this assemblage, and 3 are imports, 1 from Athens and 2 others from Corinth. Bowls are far more numerous with 23 examples. Bowls with outturned rim are totally lacking, even if this form is well attested at Athens and Corinth in the late 4th century. All bowls from the Aspis are shallow and echinus bowls with stamped decoration. One on the lower part of the screen bears under its foot the graffito Delta Alpha, most probably for damosion, namely a mark of public property. Some smaller bowls, usually named salt cellars, complete this vessel for the service of food. Only one is a Corinthian import. An important series of large and deep bowls with 2 horizontal handles remind the household lecani, but their very fine fabric and their black gloss on the inside and on the upper outside suggest that these vessels were used for the service of large quantities of food. This particular shape is not attested at Athens at the same period, but some parallels were found at Lerna and at Corinth, so that we have here another example of a regional shape of the northeastern Peloponnese in the late 4th century BC. I will not have time to present here in detail all the small closed vases produced in fineware with black gloss. They include fragments of lekitoi, some of them with vertical ribbing and stem decoration that connect them with this regional group of plaquette and basin, but also some amphoriskoi and trefoil jugs with many regional parallels. And for Anna, that are on the corner, the example that maybe could be epichysis, you will tell us after what you think about it. But most of the small fineware containers are blisterware aribaloi. 2 of them on the top of the screen are for sure Corinthian import, but the 5 others seems to be local or regional products. The one on the lower left of the screen seems to be a local imitation of blisterware in fine clay with black gloss. Surprisingly, no pyxis and no lecanis have been uncovered on the Aspis, but 7 lids that could be associated with these covered vessels. One particular lid on the top of the screen is almost completely preserved and bears a relief decoration that was printed with a roulette. 3 fragments of what seem to be large lid belong to the very scarce example of vessel with waistcoat decoration on the Aspis. A dozen of wheel-made lamps found in the Aspis date back to the 4th and at the latest to the early 3rd century, according to a very difficult comparison with the Athenians and Corinthian lamps typology. Only one of them is imported and comes from Corinth. The fineware I have presented till now can be assigned to the second half of the 4th and the early 3rd century with a high degree of certainty. This is less the case for the household and cooking wares, as it is much difficult to find published and well-dated parallels for this material. The great number of some series still allows us to think that they should belong to the same period as the huge bulk of the fineware pottery found on the Aspis. This material includes a large variety of jug with a very fine clay, but without gloss, and only a few rim of large lecani without preserved handles. Mortars are more numerous on the Aspis and seems therefore to have been preferred than the lecani for the preparation of food among many of their possible functions. These mortars find no close parallels in the Athenian and Corinthian typologies. They are characterized by a large bolster handle and not pie-crust handle that are so common in Athens and Corinth at that time. Some of them show in the inside an abrasive surface to help the user to grind food. Cooking pots include two forms of chytrai, mainly globular pots with a large rim that find close parallels at Lerna and Corinth, and a single example on the right of the screen with an internal edge to close it with a lid. It matches with the very common type 5 defined by Susan Rothschild for the Athenian chytrai. Many lopades were found on the Aspis. The first series on the left with handles high over the rim find parallels at Corinth during the first half of the 4th century and at Isthmia, Lerna, and Azine between the end of the 4th and early 3rd century. The second form in the middle corresponds with the very common form 1 of the Athenian agora that is produced until the early 3rd century at the latest. One lopas matches the form 2 of the first quarter of the 3rd century and two other the form 3 that appears at Athens around 285 BC according to Susan Rothschild. As we have seen, this assemblage contains very few imports, namely a single Athenian plate with rolled rim and 6 Corinthian vases, 2 saucer, 1 salt cellar, 1 lamp, and 2 blisterware aribaloi. The rest of the pottery is most probably of local manufacture. The production of pottery is well attested in the town of Argos through the discovery of some kilns from the prehistoric, geometric, and archaic periods. It seems logical that potters continue to supply the large population of the city during the later periods. But without a joint program of archaeometrical analysis with other pottery specialists working in the Argos and in the neighboring region, it remains in the current state of our knowledge impossible to make a clear distinction between pots produced in the city, in its surroundings area, or in other settlement in the Argive plain. If some of the vessels found on the Aspis could in fact come from the Thyratis, Northern Argolis, or Epidavros, most of them should logically have been produced at Argos itself. I would like to highlight some of the main distinctive features of the local repertoire at this time. We have seen that some shapes remain unknown at Corinth and Athens and witness therefore a kind of regionalism of the local production, namely the small 2-handled cup and the large and deep bowls with 2 handles for the food service. Some shapes also show a kind of conservatism of the local potters and consumers, as they are not produced anymore at Athens and Corinth so late in the 4th century. Examples are the late Pheidias cups and mugs, and the column craters. I shall also underline that plates are very scarce compared to echinus bowl and salt cellar. At Argos, mortars seems also to have been preferred than lecani. Among the drinking vessel, sciphoi remain predominant until the early 3rd century, as in Corinthia, and cantaroi are very few, on the exact opposite of the Athenian repertoire of the early Hellenistic period. Finally, the aribaloi and blisterware, or the imitation, are the most common containers for oil, and it seems that the gray and retaya appear later at Argos and Corinth than in Athens. The final question I'd like to quickly address is by whom this pottery assemblage has been brought and used on the top of the Aspis. The fortification system built in the late 4th century on this hill was not designed to protect an housing area, but according to its study by Sylvian Fachard, for strategic purposes to defend the lower town in the case of an attack. The long buildings within the fortification are therefore interpreted as barracks for soldiers and the architectural structure seems to match with this function. Dozens of weapons have also been discovered in several contexts. The huge amount of drinking vessels and quatters could be associated with symposia organized by a male population, and the great size of the quatters seems to reflect feasts with a large number of guests. Unfortunately, we do not have another strictly domestic assemblage of pottery at Argos at the same period to figure out if these quatters are very common at that time or somehow an exception, and if they could witness public symposia in the context of a garrison. A small bow with a graffito under its feet that could be interpreted as a marker of public property, Damasion, could be another argument for an association with a military occupation, but it remains a single example among hundreds of pots. Several objects can be associated with the presence of women on the aspice. First, a dozen of lecanis and pixis lids. These shapes are usually interpreted as boxes for jewelry or cosmetic projects, but Ian McPhee and Elizabeth Pemberton, among others, suggested that they could also be used as containers for other goods, and Brian Sparks and Lucy Talcott mentioned the option of food, so that we should not use these shapes as argument to evidence the presence of women on the hill. However, 22 loom weights and 13 spools were discovered in the late classical and early Hellenistic contexts. This material clearly witnesses the activity of within the fortification. The textile production is commonly associated in ancient Greece with women, but Thucydides and Demosthenes, as well as some inscriptions of the Hellenistic period, also mention the presence of slave and women in the garrison. I let here this question open for further discussion, and I thank you very much for your attention.